Could we just start off, perhaps, just talking a little bit about charter schools?
Sure.
And what you think the features of charter schools have been that have meant that Uncommon has been able to do such remarkable things in terms of raising achievement, particularly of some of the most deprived children?
Sure. And Charlie, before I answer the question, can I just say there's nothing to make you feel like you know nothing in the world than coming after Sir Michael Barber. So I'll offer my remarks with abject humility, knowing that the only thing I know for sure about them is that some part of them will be wrong. But, you know, the charter school movement is, we're almost 20 years old in the United States. It's exciting because it gives real power to people in the front lines to make decisions that matter every day. And when I was walking here from the tube, I was walking by a school. Parents were dropping off their children. Every different type of parent, every social class, every color in God's earth, every background, to think about how important the decisions we make in schools every day are. To respond to the aspirations of those parents. It's just an incredibly deep responsibility. And the principle of the charter school movement, I think, is that autonomy and accountability have to live together. They have to be situated at the same place in the system. And part of the challenge has been sometimes the accountability has been at a different place. The people who make the decisions have to be accountable for the results, and vice versa. So that's the fundamental premise of the charter school movement that I think is, it's produced some great schools. It's produced some terrible schools too. Fortunately, they've been closed, and I think those of us who really believe in the movement believe that's a great thing. A poor school is no better because it has charter in the name, and a great school is no worse because it doesn't have charter in the name. But maybe one point I'd like to make before we go on is that I think one of the hidden aspects of choice in charter schools is actually teacher choice. In other words, people talk all the time about the importance of parent choice and student choice, and parents being able to select schools based on their excellence or based on their meeting their desires for their children. But one of the most powerful parts of the charter school movement and the successful charter schools is the power of teacher choice, of the principals in one of our schools being able to say, this is our philosophy, this is how the organization intends to take on these challenges of the daily work. And teaching is full of these endemic challenges that we know will come up. What leader of an organization that does complex work is forced to face those complex challenges without being able to choose the people in his or her organization, and choose those people because they agree with the approach that the organization wants to take? So different organizations, different charter schools take different approach, but one of the most powerful things is a leader's ability to choose the teachers, not only for their excellence, but for their desire to take an approach, to be able to say, that's how we do it in this school. And for a teacher to be able to say, yes, I want that approach, or no, I don't. I want to go teach somewhere else. I don't want to be on an island in my school and be the one person who believes in cats when everyone else believes in dogs. So I think one of the hidden drivers of results there is the fact that teachers can choose based on philosophy, approach, as much as families and students can.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I was recently in the northeast of England in a town called Peterlee, a very deprived former mining community. And I went to a quite remarkable school called Shotton Hall Academy, which is one of our teaching schools. And the head teacher, Leslie Powell, was talking about closing the gap and about the aspirations of many of the children and many of the families in their local area. And what she described, and I will translate this for you, what she described is Incans Syndrome. And Canny-Bairn is northeastern dialect for sweet little children syndrome. And there was a sense that these are very lovely, very wonderful children, but we can't have expectations of them. You know, look at the area, look at the place, look at the parents, look at the families. This is as good as it'll get for them. Would you say something about, is there an equivalent of Canny-Bairn syndrome in the US? And would you describe about ways that you've looked to narrow the gap?
It's such a powerful question. I think that our Canny-Bairn, is that syndrome, it happens in different places. For us, it's, I understand that, in coastal towns are particularly challenging here for you. For us, it's in the entrenched inner cities. with cultures that it's still permissible in some parts of the United States to write off and say, well, those people, those families, they're just not committed and they don't believe, and those kids are never gonna. It's an incredibly, it's real, it's out there. It's an incredibly powerful thing to have to overcome. But the thing that I'm reminded of whenever I hear of that syndrome is when we talk about gaps, when we talk about achievement gaps, there's not just one achievement gap. There's a gap between the kids who are on the other side of the Incans Syndrome and the kids who are born, who have the good sense to be born into a postal code where the expectation is you'll go to university and you'll do great things. There's not just the rich-poor achievement gap, though. There's the achievement gap between our nation or your nation and where it wants to be as a nation. There's the gap between our kids, what they get and what they deserve. There is no gap out there that some teacher hasn't closed. I think we spend a lot of time thinking about the gaps that exist, and they exist in the aggregate, but there is some teacher in some coastal town who has found a way across that gap and whose expectations are incredibly high for those children and whose children are able to do, if they had that teacher for 8 or 12 years, their students would be able to do math on the level of the most privileged children. And the problem is that we haven't found her, and we don't know who she is, and we don't know how she does her work, and so we haven't replicated her practices and said, my gosh, here is this gold mine, this teacher who can do incredible things. And can I just point out, as I think about that, the failure rate of inner city teachers, which is our toughest area in the United States, the failure rate of inner city teachers is 50% over 3 years. 50% of the new people who come to the profession because they want to change the world and they believe in kids on the other side of the Incans Syndrome, they leave the profession after 3 years because it's so hard. So brutal in so many ways. And right down the hall from those people is often this mystery teacher. Who is she? Who has the solution? Who knows how to solve the problem? And they never know to walk down the hall to see this teacher and observe her and copy what she does. And so they crash out of the profession and they become real estate brokers, or they go to law school, or whatever it is that they do when they leave the teaching profession. So when I think about that gap, I think about all of the unacknowledged champions who are out there in schools who have actually crossed those achievement gaps right now. And I think our first obligation is to find them and then to understand what they do and honor them by sharing their best practices.
And to some extent, that's very much what you've done in Teach Like a Champion.
Tried to do.
Well, I think done brilliantly, which is you've looked for the best teachers. Yeah. You've looked for teachers who are narrowing that gap, who are making the difference, and you've unpicked what they're doing. And what struck me about the book, and what I think is really interesting, is a lot of the things that they're doing are actually quite simple.
Yeah.
And a lot of the techniques that you describe in the book are actually quite simple. Why do you think we get it wrong, or why do you think so many teachers get it wrong?
It's interesting. I think there are simple techniques. I don't think that because there are simple techniques, that means that the job is simple. The job is obviously incredibly complex. It's such a difficult job. And in fact, the difficulty of the job is probably why, I would hesitate to say they get it wrong, but they struggle to be excellent. One of the things we've found in doing teacher training is that the gap between I don't understand what to do and I know what to do is much, much smaller than the gap between I know what to do and now I am able to do it. Then the gap between I get it and I do it is 100 times as wide as the gap between I have no idea what to do in this classroom and what vision looks like. And so over time, what we've realized in our and the reason for that is because let's take something very simple, like in the new and improved version of Teach Like a Champion, I talk a lot about be seen looking dance moves, which are teachers have a really, really brilliant teachers have a great way of intimating to students very subtly without taking any time away from instruction that they see what they do and they're watching them all the time. And so they don't take a second away from them. I'm just trying to model them right now, right? They crane their necks as if like I see you in the back, Mr. Lemov, and you can put that away right now, right? We all had that teacher in school, and we'd said that they have eyes in the back of their head because they intimated to us very subtly that they saw everything we did, and so we felt a greater sense of accountability as students. So that's an incredibly simple thing to do. In our training workshops, we would talk about like how do you look carefully at your room to see what happens, and how do you intimate to your students that you're seeing what's happening out there. And yet, just because you know that thing, it's actually very, very hard to walk into a lesson and execute it, because you're teaching that you're trying to keep everything straight about the Battle of Hastings and all the questions that you wanted to ask, and you're watching the clock and you have 45 minutes, but it looks like it's going to take longer than 45 minutes, and you have 30 skeptical 14-year-olds in the classroom and you have to manage each one of those. So of course you can't think about that. Oh, I should be scanning the room and craning my neck right now to... I think that what that reminds me of is that teaching is fundamentally a performance profession. We never think about it that way, but it's done live in front of an audience every time you do it. It's an audience of skeptical 14-year-olds, which is an especially challenging audience. And so other people who do performance professions, football players are on my mind because of last night's game. Sorry again. But surgeons, artists, people who know that they perform live, the way that they think about their work, preparing for their work, is they call it practice. They don't call it professional development. And they try and rehearse the core things that they want to do over and over before they walk into the game. They would never dream of walking on center court at Wimbledon and trying to refine their backhand, in that match, right? They would have hit 10,000 backhands before they walked onto the field. And they wouldn't just study and rehearse the most important things. They would actually rehearse very mundane things, not because they wanted to think about them during the game, but because they didn't want to think about them during the game. They wanted to have their mind, their cognitive processing free to think about the Battle of Hastings. And so they would rehearse and they would practice 10 and 20 times scanning the classroom to see their students better while they were teaching. And so one of the reasons that I think teachers struggle to execute is because our training doesn't prepare them to play live by having lots and lots of practice. If I asked a room full of teachers in the United States, how often do you practice before you go into the game? They not only would not raise their hand, they would look at me funny. They don't even conceive of that question as being relevant. But the big driver of results in the training that we do is taking a very practical aspect of teaching and then letting people honestly practice it at tables with other adults pretending to be students 10 and 20 times so that it happens automatically when they go out in the game, and then all of a sudden people feel themselves getting better and they come to believe in the idea of training. My colleague Paul Bambrick at Uncommon School says buy-in, and teachers, of course, they're skeptical of training. They've been failed by training for so long. Buy-in is not a precondition, it's an outcome. If training is great and it really solves people's problems and they see it making them better, they will run to it.
Thank you. Ty's making faces, but I'm just going to ask one more question very briefly. I trained to be a teacher many years ago, I think 30-something years ago, and we weren't taught how to teach reading.
Yeah.
We weren't taught how to manage behaviour. Mm-hmm. We weren't taught anything on IT. I think things have moved a long way, and I think Louise, who's here, who trained with me, I was mainly in the library, Louise was in other places, but working hard, but one of the things, and things have moved a long way, but I still think, and I wanted to get your views on how we think you can improve teacher training. What are the things that we can improve the initial teacher training in teachers? And we'll have to be quite brief, I think, because Ty is making faces.
How brief? So just a couple quick thoughts about teacher training. It has to solve the real problems that teachers face in the classroom. My colleague Deborah Ball, who's the dean of faculty at the University of Michigan School of Education, describes endemic problems. Endemic problems are entirely predictable, complex challenges that you face in the course of the work. They're the opposite of exotic challenges, right? So we can all think of the exotic challenges of teaching and the story that happened to you. And those are fascinating. But what's most challenging about teaching is the entirely predictable problems of, I have this student and he can decode, but he can't comprehend anything that he reads. Or I have this student and I ask him to sit down, and when I ask him to sit down, he says, "You sit down." Like, those are that student is out there in every school in the country. It is an entirely predictable problem. And so for me, teacher training has to start with, it has to address the endemic problems of teaching. It has to start with teachers as the knowledge base that we're sharing. Teachers get told a lot, right? Experts tell teachers what to do and then teachers execute. But to me, this will become a profession when our knowledge base is derived from the work of the teachers themselves. Doctors think about themselves in this way. They are not only executing on your surgical procedure, but they're learning about how to do this procedure better. They're contributing to the knowledge of the profession. And so to me, teacher training has to come from the same frame of the people that we study to understand how teaching works are not, I mean, great if they're university teaching programs, but really the solutions to teaching problems exist in the classrooms of teachers. So it should address practical problems. It should be driven by the knowledge and wisdom of teachers themselves, and teachers should participate in doing it, and then it should be embedded in the fabric of a school. The best way to have drive-by training is what we call it in the U.S. when like some fancy pants like myself shows up and like talks to people for an hour and says, you should do this and you should do that, and then leaves and never comes back. That is not a recipe for instilling change of behavior in adults. The way to change behavior is to make it safe to be wrong, talk about an idea, have people practice it, come back about why it was hard, what worked, what didn't with our kids. Let's go out and try it again. I'll observe for it. I'll give you feedback on it as opposed to evaluating you. Like, we'll come back. So when training is connected to the observational and supervisional systems within a school that make it a live conversation, then it tends to be much more successful. So that would be another driver for me.
Thank you very much. So. Doug, it's been absolutely wonderful and fascinating, and I wish we could carry on chatting.
We can.
For much, and we can, and we will. But in the meantime, if anybody would like to go and have coffee, the coffee break, I think, is now about to happen. So thank you very much indeed. A champion, Doug Lemov.
Thank you.